motivational meditation. Sit comfortably. I'm going to have a sip of water first. Relax your body, relax your mind. And you remember what I mean by relaxing your mind. Remind yourself there's nothing else you have to think about right now other than our meditation topics. You know, the price of coffee or political situation or anything else. So first of all, as in the sutras, when the Buddha, many of the sutras would begin, the Buddha has gone out for alms, you know, receiving food from the devoted, come back to the monastery, washed his feet, sat down and placed his attention on the breathing in front. So that means the meditation we're about to do here. So that means being mindful of your respiration, keeping it in mind. It's kind of like you're paying attention to it and it alone and all the texture as it's going in, as it's just stopping, as it's just changing direction, and recognizing what you're doing. This is, you know, I'm inhaling, now it's changing, now it's exhaling. And in addition, if you can count the respirations mentally, you can say one, this is the first, or you can imagine a calendar with the sheets that flip down, you know, the number one is appearing when you're breathing in and breathing out. So the whole respiration is called one. This gives more material for your mind to concentrate on, so less access for you to multitask onto other things. Okay, I'm going to start counting mentally myself now. So myself, having done 7 respirations, maybe better if you're doing it in isolation, do 21, just enough to calm the mind a bit. Now, the next inhalation, imagine it going up to the crown of your head, down to your heart chakra. Let go of your apprehension of the breathing, your mindfulness of that, and instead pay attention to the mental consciousness, first of all, in general. Don't focus on the thoughts that are going on inside of it. Just note them. Maybe some irritation or some happiness or memory or plan of the future. And having noted the contents of the mental consciousness, try to focus on the nature of the mind within which they are arising, which is said to be clear and knowing, as we mentioned, sort of basic definition of consciousness. Here we're talking about the clarity, and we're understanding it here as its non-obstructive nature. The clarity of the mind is not an obstacle to thoughts arising or to their disappearance. Thoughts emerge from the consciousness, images, memories, thoughts, emotions, and they absorb back into it. And the clarity of the mind is not lost due to the presence of thoughts. Just as in the same way, a big stone, a big boulder, it doesn't displace the space within which it abides. In fact, the stone couldn't be there unless there was space, unless there was a lack of obstructing contact. In the same way, even if thoughts arise, you can let go of them immediately, remembering that there is this clear light nature, spacious nature within which those thoughts are arising. Here you're trying to use the wisdom function of your mental consciousness to observe this. Let go of any appearance, lingering appearance of your body to your mental consciousness. Let go of the sense of I, the observer, the subject. Like the Tibetan etymology of Daka or Dakini, the practitioners, Buddhist practitioners of, especially of Tantra. Khandro means one who moves, travels within space. Sometimes they're drawn as flying through space, but it means one who dwells in the spaciousness of the mind. Non-conceptual spaciousness. Right now, our minds are still conceptual, and our mental image of this spaciousness is just an appearance to our mind. Remind yourself to let go of that, sort of an iterative process. Let go of that mental image, and as though perceiving the spaciousness of the mind directly. you might make note that at this point, if you've gotten this far and have a little bit of concentration, that your respiration now is more subtle than when you were observing the respiration as your main object. More regular, more subtle. This conventional clear light nature of the mind is called the conventional Buddha nature, or the developmental nature, indicating that we can develop within our consciousness, mental consciousness, all of the great qualities, spiritual qualities, renunciation, compassion, wisdom, that realizes the ultimate nature of phenomena. And this clear light nature of the mind is not stained by the temporary existence of delusions, afflictions, anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, low self-esteem, and so forth. It's not even stained by the imprints of those minds, although they reside in as seeds, as imprints within the consciousness, they too can be eliminated. This is truly a great recognition, recognizing our Buddha nature, so to speak, even though this is the conventional Buddha nature. It's always with us. Think that my observation of this now, appreciation of it, is due to having found this one time a life of leisure and endowment, we call it perfect human rebirth, and that the great utility of this rebirth is that I can use it to achieve the higher goals, to have find the real meaning of life, so to speak. I can use it to eliminate my faulty states of mind, find real satisfaction. But that alone is not the higher purpose, higher meaning of this life. I can use this to develop empathy, compassion, love for other living beings, and eventually develop the aspiration to work for their benefit. So think, I'm going to participate in the class this morning with that end goal in mind. My ultimate destination is the achievement of enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And I'm going to listen and take part in the class this morning, creating the causes of that, creating virtuous karma, and developing an accumulation of wisdom. My main goal in listening this morning is to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And then arise from that concentrated state, that motivation. And recall, I don't know if I've mentioned before, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said, we have a distant goal, say enlightenment in this case, and a lot of things may take place before then. It's kind of like if you're going to Delhi, New Delhi from Dharamsala, or you're going to, where are you guys in Mexico? You're going to Albuquerque from Santa Fe or something. Along the way, maybe it's a long drive, you may stop for gas or to go to the bathroom or to get a cup of coffee. All of those things are incidental. And even if you have a bad cup of coffee or they're out of gas or whatever, it doesn't matter because you've got your long-term goal in mind. So as we have that kind of aspiration to achieve enlightenment, whatever occurs along the way, there are many ways of dealing with that in mind training. Whatever occurs along the way is of less import than our final destination. So we will recite this praise of Arya Manjushri. Here there's has an appearance, holding the sword of wisdom in his right hand that cuts through the nets of ignorance and wrong view, and his left hand holding the stem of an utpala, a blue lotus. They call it utpala flower that blooms next to his left ear. The left side is kind of related with wisdom, upon which is the Prajna Paramita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that explains the ultimate nature of phenomena. So, homage to my Lama and protector, Venerable Manjushri, who holds at his heart a scripture symbolic of seeing all as it is, whose pure genius shines like the sun unclouded by the two obscurations, who with compassion like a father for his only child, teaches with 60-fold eloquence all beings imprisoned in cyclic existence, groping in the darkness of ignorance and overwhelmed by suffering. You whose thunder-like proclamation of the perfection of wisdom arouses us from the stupor of our afflictions and frees us from the chains of karma, who wields wisdom's sword, vanquishing the darkness of ignorance, hewing down our every sprout of suffering. You who are primordially pure, finished the 10 grounds, complete embodiment of every excellence, whose princely body is graced with 112 adornments. O Manjushri, to you I bow. Please dispel the darkness of my mind. And then we will recite again this mantra, famous mantra. This is the mantra of red yellow Manjushri. There's another mantra of Manjushri, maybe many others, white Manjushri, Vagidam Nama. And that is also, the deity of many of the great lamas because it's a long life deity. White Manjushri, just like white Tara, is a long life deity, and also the special wisdom. So here we're going to recite the mantra 21 times, and then on one breath, repeat again and again the seed syllable D. You have to say it quickly on one breath to get 108 in. Om Arabazanani, 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 Om Arabazanani. Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani. Om And then imagine swallowing the syllable D at the end of your tongue, along with the saliva down to your heart, where it merges with your mental consciousness, your heart chakra. receiving the blessings of quick wisdom. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness of my mind's confusion. Grant me the light of self-assured intelligence that I may see into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them, such as the text on Buddhist tenets that we're about to study. Okay. How are you doing? Any questions, observations, either from last time or about the prayer or the meditation? Yes, Doris.
It's kind of a technical question.
Good.
You mentioned, it was interesting when you mentioned about how the respiration gets very subtle. I find that I barely breathe sometimes. So obviously not something to get concerned about.
Yeah, I don't think so. It's if when you're concentrating or you're trying to concentrate, your breathing gets more subtle, that's a good sign. That means that you're having some success in that. It's said that when you have achieved tranquil abiding, shamatha, your breathing, it becomes incredibly subtle. In Tantra, when you bring the energy currents, the prana, what we call the airs within your body, away from the side channels, all of the 83,000 channels of your body into the central channel, at that point, the breathing stops completely. And you might think, oh, I'm going to go brain dead, because what do they say with this trial now when Mr. Floyd was without respiration for a couple of minutes, they said that essentially that could, that's the cause of death. But there's no problem because the metabolism changes at that point. And your brain no longer is using, because you're in a non-conceptual state. This is talking about Tantra, right? Bringing the airs in the central channel. But there's a similarity here when the breathing slows down, your metabolism also slows down. So you don't need all of that oxygen to survive. So if you notice it becoming so subtle that you barely notice it, or you imagine that you've stopped breathing, that's okay, I think. Maybe someone will disagree, but anyway, that's my understanding. Someone else? The prayer, when we talk about Manjushri as the epitome of wisdom, right? Also has the compassionate aspect. We say in the prayer, we talked about the compassion like a father for their child. I'm not sure if the prayer said son, but you should say child. Manjushri has all of these aspects, compassionate aspect as a teacher of the bodhisattvas, the archetypal teacher of the bodhisattvas, teaching them wisdom, but out of compassion, like the compassion of a father for their child. So when we talk about the method side, method is associated in Buddhism with the right side and the male energy, and wisdom is associated with the left side and the female energy that we all have. Remember, there was some TV commercial some years ago, a little boy, I think he wanted to eat with his, there was some dessert that was being given to his sisters, and his mom and his father wanted him to go off, and the father was, You know the one I'm talking about? The father was saying, why don't you come with me? And the child's motivation was to eat the dessert, but he said, I'm trying to, he mumbled something, sort of child talk, something about coming in contact with my female side. Do you remember that? Okay, anyway, this is relevant. So Manjushri has, both the male aspects of compassion for others and the female aspect of wisdom, deep wisdom. Okay, enough of that. So we are still talking about the Sautrantika school, the followers of Sutra, so-called in one sense because they say that the Buddha's teachings on wisdom are not found in the 7 treatises of Abhidharma, but they are found in the Buddha's discourses, in the sutras, as opposed to the Vaibhashikas that accept these 7 treatises as actually the words of the Buddha, even though they all have authors, like one is composed by Shariputra and another by Maudgalyana and so forth. They still say they are the words of the Buddha. So we are talking about the ways of asserting subjects, object possessors, on page 10. This is a little going over what we talked about before. So when we talk about subjects, one of the kind of subjects is persons. So it doesn't mention it here exactly. It says, some assert the continuum of the aggregates to be an illustration of the person, and some assert the mental consciousness to be an illustration of the person. The reason this comes here under subjects is because there are 3 kinds of subjects, remember? You remember what they are? Jeremy, do you remember what the 3 kinds of subjects are? No, okay. You didn't even have to unmute. You could just show the amusement there. So we say persons because persons are said to have objects. I have my mug, and Stephen had his iPhone he was showing me before. Consciousnesses are also subjects because they, with respect to their objects that they're perceiving, they possess those objects, so to speak. They have those objects. And articulate sounds, articulate sounds denote something, some meaning, as opposed to inarticulate sounds. Inarticulate sounds would be, for instance, the sound of the trees, or the sound of the wind, unless they're induced by the omniscient mind. Sometimes the Buddha, caused sounds to teach about impermanence or something like that, but generally inarticulate sounds are not called subjects because they don't denote a particular object, right? So the proponents of sutra who follow the Abhidharma Kosha are said to be those that use the continuum of the aggregates to be the person, and the proponents of the illustration of the person being the mental consciousness, those are said to be the proponents, the followers of the 7 treatises on valid cognition. So they're a little more logical in their assertions. And then it immediately dives into consciousness as an object possessor, as a subject. So as I mentioned before, you don't have to start with valid cognizers. You could start from just the definition of sense perception and mental perception and make finer and finer divisions from there. Here, you might get the feeling, this is a little bit confusing starting from here, but I said that Jason Truki Gelson, the author of the Sarah J textbooks, had a particular aim in putting it this way. So 2 types of awareness, you could say, valid cognizers and non-valid cognizers. So remember here, when we talk about a valid cognizer, or pramana, in Tibetan sema, is a new incontrovertible knower. The newness, the fact that it has gotten to its object, it's realized its object, that means it's incontrovertible. That means you've eliminated superimpositions and misunderstanding about it. And it's a knower. It's something like when we talk about consciousness being clear and knowing. In outlining the definition of valid cognizer, it is necessary to mention the three: new, incontrovertible, and knower. We've gone over that before. There are two types of valid cognizers: direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. So valid cognizers, you could say, are sort of like the, I can't remember the Latin term, that the best of the best. Something bonum, what is it? Who's the Latin? Bob?
Summum bonum.
Summum
bonum.
Summum.
Summum bonum.
Summa?
Summum.
Summum bonum.
Bonum.
Bonum. Both of them at the end. Sunum bonum. Bonum. So valid cognizers are knowing their object, they're realizing their object, and they not only they're realizing their object, they have a certain primacy in being fresh. They know their object without depending on something other, such as the subsequent moments of a continuum of consciousness. Those subsequent moments of a valid cognizer would not be called valid. They're called subsequent cognition, but they can still realize the object. So direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. Direct valid cognizers, such as the eye, the eye consciousness that sees something, the first moment of that, realizes that object. And inferential valid cognizers, the first moment upon using a logical reasoning to deduce or to infer or to cognize a meaning by means of a sign, such as, sound is impermanent because it's a product. Once you've realized all of the subsidiary elements of that, you've thought about it again and again, the understanding arises in your mind, realization that sound is impermanent. That's the thesis, sound is impermanent. That realization is called an inferential valid cognizer. The second moment of that, from the Sautrantika point of view, is no longer valid. It's still realizing, the continuum of that is you've realized at the first moment. The second, third, fourth moment of that is no longer a valid cognizer because it's arisen. They're like the other cars of a train. They are pulled along by that first realization, which is the actual pramana. Then the definition of a direct perceiver. We're going from most precise to less and less precise. The definition of a direct perceiver: a non-mistaken knower free from conceptuality. So that free from conceptuality means it's free from all of the ordinary mental activity of the mental consciousness. Usually mental consciousness knows things by means of conception, by means of mental images. Although the mental consciousness does know and can know some things directly, its main occupation is by conception. So here it's free from conceptuality. So this does include those mental processes that are not conceptual, but it mainly is talking about the sense consciousnesses, none of which know their objects by means of conception, by means of mental image. All the sense consciousnesses know their objects directly. So they're called sense direct perceivers. But it also includes, direct perceivers also include mental direct perceivers. The definition of a direct valid cognizer. Okay, we talked about valid cognizer a moment ago. It is the first moment of realizing something. So a direct valid cognizer is a new, incontrovertible knower free from conceptuality. So there are 4 types of direct valid cognizers. This is more or less, we've talked about this before, right? This is just sort of reviewing and refreshing. Self-knowing direct valid cognizers, sense direct valid cognizers, mental direct valid cognizers. So 2 and 3, we just mentioned a moment ago. Sense direct valid cognizers, the first instant of realizing something with, say, your eye or ear or nose. Mental direct valid cognizers, well, it'll give examples here. Mental direct valid cognizer and yogic direct valid cognizers. So the definition of a self-knowing direct valid cognizer. Self-knowing, remember we talked about self-knowing, self-knowers? Autocognition, we talked about before, right? Bob? Yeah. So self-knowing is, according to the Sautrantika and some of the Chittamatrans, and even a small portion of the Madhyamikas, not the best of the best, is the same entity of a consciousness. Most consciousnesses are called other knowers. Shenrik. Shen means other. So, like say, our I consciousness is, it knows something other than itself. But within the entity of that I consciousness, there is the innate ability to recognize that you are knowing at that moment. That's called a self-knower. It's called self-knower as opposed to other knower. Other knowers know things other than themselves, as our main consciousnesses. But every other knower has within its entity the faculty, the facility of knowing its own presence, only knowing that. It doesn't know what the consciousness is knowing, because then it would be another knower. It just knows the entity of the consciousness. So the definition of a self-knowing direct valid cognizer is a new incontrovertible knower. Incontrovertible knower means that it has realized its object, that is free from conceptuality, and is only inwardly directed and just an apprehender. So there are many definitions of self-knowers. This is somewhat a little bit more elaborate. Only directed inward, so it is only knowing itself. It is not directed outward toward the object. It is only directed inward, meaning to the entity of the consciousness, and is just an apprehender. That means it is not an object that can be apprehended by something else. And it's the existence of that self-knower has to be sort of inferred, because it is just an apprehender, meaning it is not an apprehended. Okay, so then the definition of a sense direct valid cognizer. So we've got sense, so that means one of the 5 senses. Direct valid cognizer. So a sense direct cognizer, without using the word valid, could mean just when you are realizing the object that is your object of focus, right? Here, a sense direct valid cognizer is new, incontrovertible knower, means it realizes its object, free from conceptuality. This eliminates ordinary thinking from being sense valid cognizer, that arises in dependence on the physical sense power that is its uncommon empowering condition. Whoa, mouthful, right? Maybe you don't need every single word there, but most of them you need from the Sautrantika point of view. So generally, when a consciousness arises, there are three conditions that are necessary, right? Did we talk about this before? Maybe just peripherally. You need to have the object condition, that is, in this case, say, if you talk about eye consciousness, the aspect of the object that is focused on your retina, on your where within which the rods and cones, within those rods and cones, there are the actual dominant condition or uncommon empowering condition. So what does that mean? Each sense has its own, even every sense power has its own exclusive, you could say like that, its own exclusive empowering condition. Its empowering condition is, for the eye consciousness, is the eye sense power. It's called exclusive or uncommon because it's not the same empowering condition as the ear. The ear sense power has its own little receptors. What is it in ear consciousness? What do they talk about? It's sort of like a drum with certain things that beat upon us. Within that drum, there are some little philia within which the actual ear sense power resides, subtle matter within there that acts as an interface between consciousness and the sound, its object. That's called its uncommon, or you could say exclusive, empowering condition. Without an eye sense power, without that uncommon or exclusive empowering condition, the eye consciousness is incapable of making contact with the object directly. It needs that empowering condition. So the three conditions. The third condition is called the immediately preceding condition, which means there has to be a continuum of consciousness that gives rise to that first moment of eye consciousness. Either you've moved your eye from one thing to another, and there's now a new perception of something that is based upon the continuity of that eye consciousness, or if you just open your eyes for the first moment, the immediately preceding moment of eye conscious, what's called the immediately preceding moment, could be any consciousness, any other consciousness, whether it be mental or sensory, that acts as the basis for that first moment. The definition of a mental direct valid cognizer, a new is a new, again, that makes it valid, incontrovertible knower, that means it realizes its object, free from conceptuality, so it's, although it's mental, it's not conceptual, that arises in dependence upon the mental sense power that is its uncommon empowering condition. I think Shanka, the new SPC, asked if I would teach after this low rig. I'm not sure if he meant for the basic program or for another program, but in those programs, when we talk about low rig awareness and knowing, there's more, we can delve into these things more deeply. Right now, we're just getting an overview. So the mental sense power, remember I said there are there are three conditions. There's the object condition, the immediately preceding condition, and the uncommon empowering condition. What's the empowering condition of the mental consciousness? It's not the brain. You might think, like the eye, there's some kind of subtle matter there that acts as the empowering condition, or the ear, there's some kind of subtle matter within the eardrum, or some sense locations in the nose that you can perceive smell and so forth. On the tongue, there are experiments where you can do where there's certain receptors that are more sensitive to sweet or sour and so forth. In opposition to those, the mental sense power, this uncommon empowering condition, is not material. It is in fact identical to the immediately preceding moment of consciousness, the immediately preceding condition. What do you think, Bob? You took off your glasses. Is that
Yeah, I was going to ask one question that I've always, maybe it'll be too big a diversion, but is it, but so we're talking about, one moment of consciousness leads to the next for a mental consciousness. At any one given moment, can there only be one type of consciousness present? For example, in this present moment, can I have an eye consciousness, but not simultaneously a mind consciousness? Or can I have several consciousnesses simultaneously present?
okay? So the two parts of that. You can have all five sense consciousnesses functioning and the mental consciousness functioning at the same time. Or you could just have, mostly they're all going to be functioning to some degree. They may be inattentive, as we'll talk about later. But if you talk about one consciousness, you can't have two eye consciousnesses at the same time, even though there's two eyes. They're both going into the consciousness, maybe sort of puts them together or something. You can't have two mental consciousnesses at the same time. One that's thinking of bodhicitta and one that's thinking of wisdom or something like that. You can only have one mental consciousness at one time. Okay, does that kind of address? Okay.
Yeah, so what you're saying is you can only have one type of each type of consciousness at a time, but you can have of different types, they can be simultaneously. Like
you can have different consciousnesses of different types, meaning, eye, ear, nose, and so forth. When you taste, often our taste is dependent upon our sense of smell, isn't it? If you were to close your nose and eat some things, they may taste different than if your nose consciousness is actually present. You imagine that the totality of that taste is different. So mental direct valid cognizers. Let me see here. We come later when we talk about mental. Generally, I don't see it here. Maybe we've talked about it before. It's coming up. So generally, a mental direct perceiver, whether it be valid or not, whether it be the first moment or the subsequent moments, only takes place in ordinary beings, only takes place for one instant. Mental direct perceivers. This is in general, in the waking state. Sleep may be also a mental direct perceiver, but in general, say for instance, when I see something with my eye consciousness, the very next moment, the mental consciousness has one instant of direct perception of that object. Because it's only one instant, one thought instant, it goes unobserved. It's what's called an inattentive perception. We'll be talking about that later. Other mental direct perceptions are when you have clairvoyance, usually if you talk about mental direct perception of selflessness for the Sautrantika school, that's put in a different section. That's put in yogic direct perception, because it depends on, that kind of direct perception depends upon having a union of tranquil abiding and penetrative insight. Here we're talking about mental direct perception. Here is talking about without the addition of that very special state of mental consciousness, union of shamatha and vipassana, just the ability for mental consciousness to know things directly. It is said that dream consciousness, and there's some debate about this, but I think the general view is that dream consciousness, although you might think when you wake up that it was conceptual, just like daydreaming. We talk about daydreaming. Daydreaming would generally be conceptual. But dreams, the dream state, when you're actually in not only deep sleep, but what do we call in the West, REM, dream state, rapid eye movement state, when your mental consciousness is in a dream, those are said to be mental direct perceptions. And they don't last just one instant. So there are some examples of mental direct valid cognizers, but they are few. The definition of a yogic direct valid cognizer. So this is a particular kind of mental, it's mental, but it is based on its own, what do we say here? Realize dependence on meditative stabilization that is a union of calm abiding and special insight that is its own uncommon, exclusive, empowering condition. So there, the empowering condition is not just a previous moment of consciousness in general, but the empowering condition is that your mind has achieved this union of tranquil abiding and penetrative insight. So it's able to know things directly, unlike the ordinary mental direct perception, but it has a limited scope here. The definition of yogic direct valid cognizer is a special wisdom, exalted wisdom. In Tibetan, we say Yeshe or Jnana in Sanskrit, that directly realizes either subtle impermanence. There are three things: subtle impermanence, gross selflessness of persons, or subtle selflessness of persons. Independence upon the samadhi, meditative stabilization, here is how they translate samadhi. Tibetan says tingnazen, that is a union of calm abiding and special insight, which in turn is its uncommon empowering condition. So the uncommon empowering condition of a mental consciousness is a previous moment of mental consciousness. But here, for the particular kind of mental consciousness, it's called yogic direct perceiver. It's special. It's not physical. It's not like the brain is the counterpart. We might think, because the eye, the ear, the nose, sense bases or sense organs are physical. The empowering, we might think that the empowering condition of mental consciousness is the brain. People often associate thinking with the brain. From a Buddhist perspective, that is not its uncommon empowering condition. So there are three types of yogic direct perceivers or cognizers: those that realize subtle impermanence, those that realize the coarse selflessness of persons, and those valid cognizers, yogic direct valid cognizers, that realize the subtle selflessness of persons. So remember, in this context, subtle impermanence, you know what that means. That means momentariness. So it's not something that you perceive Although subtle impermanence is appearing to your your eye consciousness does not perceive subtle impermanence. It can perceive gross impermanence. You know, your mug falls to the ground and breaks, you know, your cell phone falls in the parking lot and the screen shatters, you know. You can see that. You can see the dirt slowly coming off as you wash the dishes. So that's the example of gross impermanence. But subtle impermanence is only perceived by the mental consciousness as capable, and it has to have that union of tranquil abiding and penetrative insight in order to perceive it. That is a big deal. Lama Yeshe used to say, if you've realized subtle impermanence, maybe to ordinary people, you appear to be an arhat. You know, you realize the momentariness of all of the kinds of things we get upset about. And therefore, your mind doesn't hold on to them in the same way. It doesn't have what's called permanent grasping, which is the cause of a lot of our delusions. So there are two kinds of selflessness of persons, according to the Sratantaka. When we talk about Chittamatra, some Chittamatrans and Madhyamikas, they'll say that this first one, the coarse selflessness of persons, is different. But here, the coarse selflessness of persons is the absence of a permanent, partless, and independent person, or permanent, partless means unitary, and independent person. This is the kind of person that was hypothesized. Maybe it's even, maybe it even fits with the conception of persons of the religions of the book, you know, the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, maybe, or some even some non-religious conceptions of the person. Here, that perception is only something that comes about from intellectual inculcation, you know, sort of like intellectually attained. We don't naturally have a conception that the person is permanent, partless, or say unitary, or independent. So from this point of view, although the Sautrantikas say you will necessarily realize that, it's not necessary to realize that to achieve liberation. The real selflessness of persons that you need to achieve liberation is the subtle selflessness of person, is the recognition that the person is empty of being, self-supporting, but substantially existent in the sense of being self-supporting. There is a innate, not just an intellectually formed, but an innate conception that we've had since beginningless time, that there is a kind of person who is substantially existent, that is self-supporting in the sense of it has a kind of substance, in the same way that, remember when we talked about trees and the forest. A forest is something that's said to be imputedly existent, because imputedly existent, you have to perceive all of its parts in order to perceive its existence. Just seeing one tree, you can't say validly that you've seen the forest. Or seeing one soldier, you can't say that you've seen the army. You need to see a conglomerate of them. This is from the perspective of the Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas. Substantially existent phenomena are things like a tree, as opposed to the forest, the substance of which you see, and it supports itself. These two kinds of selflessness of persons they can be recognized directly with the yogic direct perception, but they are, so there's a subtlety here. It's from selflessness of persons. Is it permanent or impermanent? Who wants to make a stab? Venerable Yarbel. Are you there? You've turned off the sound? Oh, yeah. Is the selflessness of persons permanent or impermanent?
The selflessness of persons is permanent. I would say it has to be permanent
Why is that?
because as long as the person is existing, excuse me, as long as the person is existing, the selflessness, the lack of inherent existence would be existing, and that would be unchanging.
Right. It wouldn't be that one moment you're selfless, and then the next moment you have a self. Once you've realized that, it remains the same. It's permanent. So
Yes.
from the Sautrantika point of view and the Vaibhashika point of view, if something is an object of direct perception, it has to be what? Bob, do you know? Or Yarpel, do you know?
Impermanent.
It has to be impermanent.
Right.
So the object of selflessness, which is, we can say is an object, it's an existence, it's something that exists, is not the actual object, the direct object of the yogic direct perceiver of selflessness. Okay, you have to think about this for a minute. What
Say
you
that
actually
again.
are, go on.
Can you say that again?
I could, but I forgot what I said, so I'll put it another way. I forgot the phraseology I was using. It's like this. What the yogic direct perceiver realizing selflessness of persons actually perceives directly is the aggregates which they themselves, or you could say from the point of view of the individuals that say it's the continuum of the mental consciousness, it directly perceives the aggregates or the mental consciousness as being impermanent, or as being impermanent and lacking substantial existence. It realizes the aggregates, and implicitly, or on the side, what do we say? Explicit as opposed to, what's another word for implicit? Explicit and indirect, direct and indirect. It realizes directly the aggregates, which they themselves are impermanent. And as a result of that, it indirectly realizes or implicitly realizes that they are therefore lacking being permanent. This is talking about the gross selflessness of persons. We'll talk about a little bit more later. So there's a distinction made here. It is a direct perceiver, yogic, what do we call it? A yogic direct perceiver, or yogic, the first moment, a yogic direct valid cognizer, but it's not cognizing directly emptiness or selflessness. What it's actually directly perceiving is something which is impermanent, such as the aggregates or the mental consciousness. And indirectly, you realize, oh, therefore, it's empty of being permanent. The part about self-supporting substantially existent, which is the more subtle actual selflessness of persons, I'll deal with a little bit later, how that's doing. But the same thing, it's realizing something which is impermanent, and by the way, implicitly, you're realizing the lack of it being permanent and so forth. Okay, does that help a little? There's a distinction made there. According to Madhyamaka, Prasangika especially, the mental consciousness can know permanent phenomena. Direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers can know permanent phenomena. Here in the Sautrantika and Vaibhashika schools, a mental direct perceiver or yogic direct perceiver, being a direct perceiver, its object has to be impermanent. For the upper schools, you can have a direct realization of emptiness with your mental consciousness, this yogic direct perceiver. It can realize something which is impermanent directly. So that's a big difference with these lower schools. They say, although you're realizing it with yogic direct perception, you're not realizing it directly or nakedly. You're realizing it implicitly or indirectly. Does that make sense? You have to think about it. The definition of an inferential valid cognizer. So this is a conceptual mind that is realizing something, not directly, but by means of the conclusion of a logical argument using a sign. Say, for instance, that's another classic. The example I gave you before is on a lake at night. The smoke, the fluffy stuff that I see in front of me is fog. And a lake at night in which fire is not observed, because if a fire existed on a boat or something, you would observe it at night, right? Because it would be quite apparent, as opposed to the daytime where it might be mistaken with some other bright things. At a lake at night where smoke is not observed, the foggy stuff that appears in front of you, I can't think of the other word that's used, the mist that appears in front of you is fog. Because you can realize that because it is not smoke, because if it was smoke, there would have to be fire and preceding it, and a fire would be observable on a boat at night. There's many kinds of inferences that you can use. So the definition of an inferential valid cognizer is a new, incontrovertible, that means it realizes its object, determinative knower, which just means conceptual knower. It's knowing by means of a mental image that is produced in dependence upon the correct sign that is its basis. Correct sign doesn't mean like a stop sign or something like that. It means a logical, it's a term, a correct mark or sign. Say, for instance, the correct sign in the proof of sound is impermanent because it's a product. The correct sign is product. Okay. So here, I mentioned, just because a lot of you are interested in the subject of debate and logic and so forth, just a little bit of introduction, we'll talk about more. When you have a logical argument, you have a subject, say sound. You have a predicate, is impermanent, because you can have two kinds of predicates, is and exists kind of predicates. So the two together, the subject and the predicate, constitute the thesis that you're making. Sound is impermanent. If you just say sound is impermanent to someone and they believe you, they may not have, they may be a highly realized person and they agree with you because they've realized it, but if they haven't realized it, that itself doesn't constitute a realization. They say, oh, George said sound is impermanent, or George said that there's selflessness of persons, or Buddha said, or Dalai Lama said, or Lama Zopa said, or Bob said. That just constitutes the wisdom risen from hearing, which is an inferior kind of wisdom, just accepting something because it's been stated. What you need to have is because sound is impermanent, because it's a product of causes and conditions. That, not the word because, but the sign or the mark, the correct mark here is product, because it is a product. You have to have an is there if you have an is predicate, or exists there if you had an exist predicate. Sound is impermanent because it's a product. In order for that to be a correct sign to prove to you, if you mull about it, there has to be what's called the property of the subject. First of all, there's three conditions which you could reduce to two, but the two or three things that have to be present. There has to be the property of the subject. That means the subject has to be the sign. In this case, what is that? Sound is impermanent because it's a product. What would that property of the subject be? Who is the other ordained person? Oh yeah, Tenzin Jiangzhu. Sound is impermanent because it's a product. If I talk about the property.
You say sound is a product.
Yeah. Is sound a product? I'm asking you.
Yes.
It's a product of causes and conditions. Anything that is a product, it has come about because of causes and conditions, and can cause other things, right? So that's called the property of the subject. If you're debating with someone and they give an argument to you, and there is not the presence of the property of the, what do we call it? Property of the subject. There's no congruence between the subject and the sign. You would say tak madrup. Tak means sign. Madrup means not established. The sign is not established. There are only three answers you can give in debate. If someone is debating with you, if they give some argument, you can only say chichir, which means why. Like, say, for instance, they said sound is a product. They didn't give a reason. You could say why. That's they just make some statement without any kind of reasoning. If there is not the property of the subject, if there's no congruence between the subject and the sign, you say the sign is not established. Or in debating live, you say tag madrup. Big bluster, your foot comes off the ground, you slap your hands, you pull your rosary up, your arm. Have you seen Tibetan debate? Yeah. So these are the only answers that can be given. You can say, someone is proposing something to you. You're sitting on the ground. The other person is saying something. You can say chichir, which means why. You can say tagmadrup, means the sign is not established. Or you can say kyapa majong. Kyapa means pervasion. Majung means doesn't arise. There's no, or in other words, there's no pervasion. So what would be an example of that? Sound is a product because it's an object of ear conscious. Sound is impermanent because it is an object of knowledge. Is sound an object of knowledge? Can it be known? No? Yeah. Yeah, it's an object of knowledge. Or sound is impermanent because it exists. Sound exists. That's sound exists, or you could say, is it object of knowledge? It has the property of the subject. Sound is that, but there's no pervasion that if it exists, that is that it is necessarily impermanent. There are also permanent things that exist, right? So just existing, there's no pervasion or necessity that it be impermanent. So in a situation like that, your answer would be Kyapa Majong. There is no pervasion, or the pervasion doesn't arise. Make sense? They'll come back, they'll come later when we're talking about correct assumption and so forth also. So there are three types of inferential cognizers. Inferential cognizers are based on a correct sign or reason, like sound is impermanent because it's a product. Generally, when you have a correct reason, you also have to have one other element. Do you know what that is, Bob?
What was the question again? Sorry.
Besides the property of the subject and the pervasion, you have to have
You,
one
you
other.
got to have the counter pervasion also. You need no pervasions, forward and backwards.
Yeah, generally it's proved in the primitive article that if you have one of those pervasions, a forward or reverse pervasion, the other will also exist. So it's sufficient to have one, but you're right. They're generally called the property of the subject, the forward pervasion, and the reverse pervasion. I won't go into that right now because you have to have double negatives here all along. But there's another element that's necessary, and that's said to be a correct example.
Oh, yeah.
Sound is impermanent because it's a product. Like what? Maybe like the sound of the bell, where you see that it is produced by the, maybe sound of the bell is not a perfect example, but generally the example is something that you realize, that you can realize the pervasion before you realize it on the actual predicate. Maybe too much detail right now. Okay, so there are three types of inferential valid cognizers. Inferential cognizers by the power of the fact, inferential cognizers by renown or through renown, and inferential cognizers through belief. So what does that mean? So there's three ways here that you can say. Generally, you could say there's two, because the second one is also by the power of the fact, but that'll come out later. Inferential cognizer by power of the fact. An illustration of an inferential cognizer by the power of the fact is an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent by the sign product. Or you could say reason product. Okay, that's one that we've talked about. That would be called by the power of the fact. An illustration of an inferential cognizer through renown is an inferential cognizer realizing that rabbit bearer is suitable to be called by the term moon by the sign existing among objects of conception. Whoa, what does that mean? Do names inherently exist within the objects? As soon as you see this for the first time as a child, you'll say, oh, mug. Yeah. Names do not adhere naturally in objects. They are at your discretion. There are many streets whose names change, or airports that's come up recently, or army bases, the names of which, depending on political situations, no longer called, named after Confederate general or something, but later called something else, right? Names are decided upon. Oftentimes they have a consistency over some period of time. Someone names something at one point, and by popular convention that continues for some time. But it could be called anything else. And certainly we know in different languages, what we call dog, Tibetans call ki, or the Spanish would call perro, if I pronounce right. What's it in French? What's dog? Roanna?
Chien. C-H-I-E-N, le chien.
Chien.
Okay.
I can't, when I,
You don't put the N on the end. There are a lot of
chien, chien.
chien, yeah.
When I teach in Singapore, there are a lot of Chinese, and there's all China, and I can't remember the Chinese word for dog, but so it's not as though an object has one name. Now, the moon, what we call the moon, could be called anything else. In fact, figuratively speaking, one of the names that's in Sanskrit literature for moon is the bearer of the rabbit. Do you know why that is? What do we see in the moon when we see children? What do they supposedly see? The man in the moon or something, right? I don't remember what that means, whether that means the face or whatever, man in the moon. So depending on the orientation of how you see the moon, if you look at the moon, you can see what appears to be a rabbit, sort of like an outline of a rabbit. So that's one of the literary names, in poetry, poetic names of the moon. So here it says, an illustration of an inferential cognizer through renown. So renown means what is common parlance. An illustration of an inferential cognizer through renown is an inferential cognizer realizing that rabbit bearer, so it's not calling the moon, but using another name for it. Rabbit bearer is suitable to be called moon by the sign because it exists among objects of conception. In other words, anything that exists among objects of conception can be called anything. Does that make sense? That's not maybe, although there's historical reason for mentioning this, you could say that kind of inferential cognizer is still an inferential cognizer by the power of the fact. Third here, inferential cognizers through belief. So here we have to talk about another subject. There are three kinds of phenomena. Remember, the pizza pie of phenomena can be divided different ways. One way of dividing them is to manifest phenomena, slightly hidden phenomena, and deeply hidden phenomena. Three kinds of phenomena. Manifest phenomena are things that you don't have to use a reason to realize, although in some cases you might use a reason. Say, for instance, that my mug is silver colored, or this marker is yellow. That is something that doesn't have to, that's a manifest phenomenon. It's something that can be perceived directly by the senses, or that this water has a little bit of lemon essence and mineral drops. David Mackley's taught me to get this mineral drops. Remember when I was at your house? Because if you filter out all of the stuff, like I have one of these zero filters, takes out everything and no minerals, doesn't taste quite the same. So David taught me to get this, because of minerals you drop in, and then it starts to taste a little bit more normal. So that's a manifest phenomena. It doesn't need to have reasoning. Slightly hidden phenomena are phenomena that cannot be perceived directly at first without depending upon a correct sign, an inferential cognizer. So excuse me, phenomena are like this are selflessness, it's subtle impermanence. You can't perceive it directly at first without depending upon a correct sign, like even a yogic direct perception that realizes subtle impermanence or gross or subtle selflessness has to rely upon a correct sign, first of all, and then you can have that yogic direct perception. Usually when we talk about emptiness in the Mahayana, we say the same thing. At first, when you think about emptiness, you may have a mental image of that. You don't have a direct perception of emptiness at first. It's not something that can be accessed directly. You have to depend upon a conceptual understanding of that. And over time, your mental image becomes, first of all, more and more factually concordant. At first, it may be completely wrong, or you have wrong reasons or so forth. It's sort of like a misunderstanding of emptiness, just a cloudy understanding. But when you have, first of all, a correct, factually concordant understanding of emptiness, by meditating on that again and again, the mental image becomes more and more subtle, like the removal of veils from the many veils on the king's queen. You know, take one veil, there's still another veil, subtler veils, protecting her being seen, right? When you've really removed all of the veils, you can have a direct perception of that. So manifest phenomena, you don't need to have inferential cognition. You can see it directly. Subtle, slightly hidden phenomena, you might say emptiness seems like really hidden, but it's only called slightly hidden phenomena, are things that can be realized directly by a human being by depending on a correct sign. You can realize it. You can eliminate superimpositions. Even not talking about direct realization, you can have a correct realizing, incontrovertible realization of that by depending upon a correct sign. Third kind of phenomena are what are called deeply hidden phenomena. Deeply hidden phenomena are things, phenomena that cannot be realized by depending on an inferential cognizer by the power of the fact. Say, for instance, the example that's often given is, there's a famous quotation in the sutras, through generosity, there are resources. That means the karmic result of giving is to create the karma that you yourself will receive resources in the future, right? Through morality, what does it say? There is high status. So the karmic result of practicing the morality, abstaining from negative actions and creating virtuous actions, is that you will be born in high status. There are other results of that, but that's one of the results. Have you ever heard that kind of expression before? Through giving resources, very briefly, you can add more words. Through giving resources, from morality, high status. So that alone is not a deeply hidden phenomena. One can realize in general that being generous creates the karma to yourself receive resources. But what is the exact ripening? Like you give one loaf of bread to the Buddha, you don't know how that will ripen in the future. Examples, when the Buddha, in the Jataka tales or in many kinds of stories of the former lives of the Buddha prophesized that someone, or even in this life, in the life of Shakyamuni Buddha, someone offered the Buddha a loaf of bread. And he said, as a result of this, in a future eon, you will become a Pratyeka Buddha with this name in this place and so forth and so on. That is what's called a deeply hidden phenomena, the exact ripening of karma and what particular rebirth you will be born in and so forth. Those are deeply hidden phenomena. We can only know those things by depending upon the proclamation of an omniscient being, such as the Buddha, a valid being, in this case, or Jewish would say a real mensch, maybe even more than a mensch, a super mensch, someone who can perceive this directly through omniscience. So even deeply hidden phenomena are accessible directly only to the omniscient mind, but they can still be realized inferentially. We can realize that if we've proved that the person who's saying that is a valid person with respect to that subject. So here, I have to put my glasses on again. Which ones do I need? Reading glasses. An illustration of an inferential cognizer through belief, this is the one we're talking about, is, for example, an inferential cognizer realizing that the scripture, due to generosity, wealth, or resources, due to ethics, happiness, or usually high status or happiness, and so on, the inferential cognizer realizing one of those, you could say, scriptural statements, what was said, and so on, realizes that is incontrovertible with respect to the meaning indicated by it through the sign, a scripture verified by the threefold analysis. So this is talking about not hearing it from the Buddha himself, but reading a text which is, what does it say here? Scriptural citation that is verified by the threefold analysis. The threefold analysis means that it is not contradicted by other valid scriptural statements of the Buddha, that it is internally consistent, and it is not controverted by direct perception. When we talk about Lorig, we'll talk about those in more detail. But essentially what it means is, in order to realize a deeply hidden phenomena, you have to, because you can realize that when a person gave this loaf of bread to the Buddha, that they would be born as this person in the future, having realized that the Buddha is an incontrovertible person. And then it says an inferential cognizer through renown is necessarily an inferential cognizer by the power of the fact. In other words, it doesn't depend upon belief. Then if it is a direct perceiver, it is not necessarily a direct valid cognizer or a direct valid perceiver. Why is that? And if it is an inferential cognizer, it is not necessarily an inferential valid cognizer, because the second moment of a sense direct perceiver apprehending form, and the second moment of an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent are subsequent cognizers. It's something we've gone over before. So only the first moment of a direct perceiver or an inferential cognizer are called valid. The first moment of a direct perceiver and the first moment of an inferential cognizer are valid cognizers. Later moments of those cognizers, since they are not different in terms of establishment and abiding, being a continuation of those, are not valid cognizers. So the grammar here to me seems a little bit incorrect when it says sense. I think you could say later moments of those two are not different in establishment, in terms of establishment and abiding. Therefore, being a continuation of those, they are not valid cognizers. In other words, the subsequent moments, like the subsequent end cars of a train, are not different in terms of establishment and abiding, the continuum, but they are not valid cognizers because they are not new. Think about that. The definition of a non-valid cognizer is a knower that is not new and incontrovertible. The upper schools above Sautrantika would leave off new. They would say a non-valid cognizer is one which is controvertible or not incontrovertible. It has not realized its object. There are 5 types of non-valid cognizers. You could take the pizza, divide into valid cognizers and invalid cognizers when you talk about cognition, knowing. And then you divide up the non-valid cognizers into 5 divisions. Subsequent cognizers are not valid. Why? Actually, subsequent cognizers realize their objects by definition. Subsequent cognizer means having realized something, the subsequent moments of that, moments after that initial. So they do realize their objects, but they are not valid according to Sautrantika. According to Prasangika, subsequent cognizers are valid cognizers. They don't have to be new. Even the subsequent moments are valid cognizers. Another type of non-valid cognizer are wrong consciousnesses, perverted consciousnesses, just, wrong. Wrong consciousness. Well, it'll come to the examples. Say a wrong consciousness would be because you have jaundice, seeing what is in reality a white snow mountain, seeing it as having a yellow tinge, or seeing what appears to be a circle of fire due to the fact that someone is revolving a torch around in a circle. Right? Wrong consciousness. Another kind of wrong consciousness, perverted consciousness, just wrong would be conceiving that there is a self of persons, that the person is not empty, that there's not a selflessness of persons, but perceiving some kind of permanent, partless, independent person, or conceiving of a self-supporting, substantially existent person. Those would be called wrong consciousnesses. Another kind of wrong consciousness, a non-valid consciousness, is doubt. Is doubt a wrong consciousness? Rowena, why not?
It has, because the way you define something, I'm not sure I can really answer. I know that it's not always wrong. You can doubt that something has a quality, I don't think I can explain it, Venerable George.
No, I think you're getting a good point there. So, see, there are different kinds of doubt. There's
Yeah.
a doubt, that you hear the Dalai Lama explain emptiness, or
Okay.
Bob explains something, and you think, well, it could be right, but not absolutely sure. But it's probably could be. That is a doubt. Doubting consciousness is one which is of like two sides. It hasn't reached a conclusion among two things. So there are doubts that are leaning in the right direction, correct direction. Sound might be permanent, might be impermanent, but it's probably impermanent. There are doubts that think sound might be permanent or impermanent, but it's probably permanent. Still a doubt. You haven't completely reached a conclusion about it. If you reached a conclusion about that and said it is permanent, that would be a wrong consciousness. If the doubt tending to the right direction, sound maybe permanent or impermanent, probably impermanent, what would that be?
Tending to the right direction.
That would be in the right direction. That would be called, if you actually went beyond the doubt and said, oh, it is impermanent, that probably is at that point just a correct belief, because you haven't realized it yet. You go from doubt in general to doubt tending in the right direction to correct assumption. And then when you realize it with a reason, an inferential cognizer, it becomes a realization. So doubts can be wrong consciousnesses if you think it's probably permanent. Sound is probably permanent. There's also a kind of doubt which is equal. I don't know. It could be. Person could be empty of could be selfless, could be self. I'm just an ordinary being. I don't know. Don't ask me. That kind of doubt where you haven't not tending to one direction or the other. That's called equal doubt. So then another kind of non-valid cognizer, besides the fact that it's you could say non-realizing consciousness also, correct assumptions. Correct assumptions are having heard something, just assuming that is that way. We'll talk the divisions of correct assumptions in the next page or so. And then so those they don't realize their object, correct assumptions, although they can be the basis of realizations. When you have a correct belief or correct assumption. Correct assumption here you could call correct belief. A fifth kind of non-valid cognizer is awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. It makes a note here, inattentive awareness has been changed. So nangla mangepe lo. So literally it means an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained, but we often call that inattentive perception, right? So what that means is a famous example on, crime show, the detective says, did you see the car? I say, yeah, I saw the car. What was the license plate? I might have flashed by me, but I didn't pay attention. I can't remember. Inattentive perception is a perception to which an object clearly appears, but your mind, your mental consciousness was not paying enough attention to that it can induce a memory of that. Sometimes with hypnosis, you can be caused to remember something that in the chaos of some situation you can't remember, but you can, through hypnosis, you can be brought back to that and remember that. Would that be an inattentive perception then? No, it was that the mind paid enough attention that when it was calmed down, it could recall that object. So an inattentive perception, like for instance, for the women in the crowd, you're watching the football game with your husband or your boyfriend or a friend, and you say, honey, could you get some chips, or could you do this and that? And they're looking at the football game. The sound appeared clearly to their ear, but because their mental consciousness was concentrating on the football game, their mental consciousness cannot induce a remembering consciousness of that. So that's called inattentive perception. Or for the guys, you're at the ballet and your girlfriend or wife is watching the beautiful, sophisticated ballet, and you say something to them, and they don't respond because they're concentrated. They're putting all of their mental attention on the beauty of the ballet. That would be another example of an inattentive perception. Or an awareness to which an object appears, but that awareness does not ascertain the object. To ascertain it means that it can induce a remembering consciousness of it. Okay. So there are two types of subsequent cognizers: conceptual subsequent cognizers and non-conceptual subsequent cognizers. So this is simple. Example of a conceptual subsequent cognizer. Examples are a remembering consciousness, remembering blue, that is generated through being induced by a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue. So that what that means is you saw blue, and then later, completely different situation, your mental consciousness can remember that you saw blue. And another example of, so that's subsequent to the original realization, right? This can be a remembering consciousness can be, what did we say here? Can be a realizing consciousness. You can, if you've realized something before, when you remember that realization, that can still be a realizing consciousness. It may not be valid because it's not the first instant, but for the upper tenets, that can still be, certainly that can be, from the upper tenets, it can be valid, but here it can still be a valid cognizer. So in one sense, you've seen it with your eye sense, and later a memory, you can remember that you saw blue. That is example of a conceptual subsequent cognizer. So although it was first realized by the eye consciousness, later when you remember that, those subsequent moments of memory are called conceptual subsequent cognizer. So another example is of a conceptual subsequent cognizer would be having realized selflessness with conception. The subsequent moments of that are no longer valid, but they're still realizing consciousnesses. They're still they're called subsequent cognizers, the subsequent moments of that. An example of a non-conceptual subsequent cognizer, so this means with sort of like through direct perception, is the second moment of a sense direct perceiver apprehending form. That's easy, right? The definition of a wrong consciousness is a knower that engages its object erroneously. So there are conceptual wrong consciousnesses and non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. An example of a conceptual wrong consciousness is a conception apprehending sound to be permanent, or a conception apprehending a self of persons. Those would be called wrong consciousnesses. Example of a non-conceptual wrong consciousness, or as a direct perception, is our sense consciousnesses to which one moon appears as two moons, or a sense consciousness to which a snow mountain appears blue. Before I said snow mountain appears yellow, that's due to jaundice. Snow mountain appearing blue due to deprivation of oxygen, it said at high altitudes, sometimes the perception, the color appears wrong like that. But one moon appears two, what is that? You know, can you do this? Let me look at Bob. I can't get it right. Oh, there's two Bobs. You know, due to some kind of impediment in the eye, there can be the appearance of something which doesn't really exist, such as two Bobs. Okay. Okay, those are non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. Then the definition of doubt. So why are we talking about doubt? Because we're talking about non-valid cognizers or non-realizing cognizers. A doubt is a mental factor. When we talk about low rig later in subsequent courses, there is a general state of mind that's called doubt, one of the ways of knowing. Here it's not talking about that. This is talking about the mental factor doubt. You know what mental factors are? We talk about main minds and mental factors, or that which arisen from the main mind. Say, for instance, every consciousness, every mind, every consciousness has 5 omnipresent mental factors. You know what they are? Bob, you know what the 5 omnipresent mental factors are?
Yeah, I forget. It's things like attention and
Attention, intention, contact, feeling. What else? Discrimination. So feeling, discrimination, intention, attention, and what? Check. 5 omnipresent mental factors. So here, doubt is a mental factor, not omnipresent, not always present, which by its own force hesitates with respect to 2 alternatives. In other words, it's uncertain about 2 alternatives. You know, sound is impermanent or impermanent, you know. The mental consciousness concomitant with doubt, so the mental factor, the mental consciousness and its accompanying feeling are not that which by their own force hesitate with respect to 2 alternatives, because they hesitate with respect to 2 alternatives due to the force of doubt. So doubt here is talking about by its own force, it hesitates. So it's talking about the mental factor doubt. So there are 3 types of doubt: tending toward the factual, tending away from the factual, and even doubt. Equal position, you know. An example of doubt tending toward the factual is a doubt that thinks sound is probably impermanent. actually the Tibetan says that thinks is a doubt that thinks isn't sound and permanent. You know, kind of like same sense. Sound is probably isn't sound impermanent? You know, not completely certain, leaving open that's what literally what the Tibetan says. Here we've translated it as sound is probably impermanent. The word probably isn't in the Tibetan.
Venerable
Example.
George,
Go on.
Venerable George, I think Tenzin Jangchup has a question for us. It looks like he's
Okay,
raised
I
his
don't.
hand.
Oh, that was Stephen saying that. Tenzin Jangchup, what's your question? Where's Tenzin?
Could you explain what the 5 concomitances with doubt are? I've read that a few times and I can't figure out what the 5, it says a mental consciousness and an accompanying feeling that have the 5 concomitances with doubt.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea what that
Where,
means.
is
and
that
I
on
can't
page
find
12?
Well, in my text, it's on page 10.
Okay, what does it say?
It says it's under the definition of a doubt, and it says a mental consciousness and an accompanying feeling that have the 5 concomitances with doubt.
Do any of you see on the text that I could address that, but I don't see that. Is that the same text as Jason Tricky Jelson's? What, Bob?
Yeah,
I think
found it.
actually I
think
have
it-
a
I think
different
it's the
version, so I'm
McDonald
not sure.
translation.
Hold,
It's McDonald
what's that?
translation.
Hanson, Bob, what did you say?
It's the McDonald, the Kathleen McDonald
Oh,
translation.
okay, yeah. And so what is that? And it's accompanying mental factors which by their own force. So I think she may have added some extra words. So you said, Tenzin Jangchup, you said it's the mental consciousness concomitant with doubt and its accompanying feeling. And what did you say your text said?
It says it's a mental consciousness and an accompanying feeling that have the 5 concomitances with doubt. That's what her translation says, and it doesn't make any sense to me because I've never found I don't even know what a concomitance with doubt would even be,
Okay.
unless it's
So when we talk about mind and mental factors, mind refers to the mere entity of the consciousness. That is, for instance, when we talk about the 5 aggregates, you know what the 5 aggregates are, right? What do we say? Form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and mind. So leaving off form, you have mind, feeling, discrimination, and compositional factors. All of those are called mental factors. There's a reason in the Abhidharma why you don't just say mental factors, because feelings are the main reason that ordinary beings engage in samsara. You want to have good feelings. You want to have, beer and sex and, diversion and so forth. Discrimination is the main reason that pundits or intellectuals engage with samsara. They debate about different things like politics and so forth. All the other mental factors are included in the compositional factors aggregate. So between mental factors like feeling, discrimination, anger, attachment, so forth, the difference between those and mind in the 5 aggregates, mind is called the primary mind, just the mere entity of consciousness that knows the general perceptual field. The mental factors all engage in particular aspects of the mental field of the perceptual field, such as feeling, discrimination, and so forth. So there are 5 what did you call concomitances, similarities between these. It's my medical center calling up about an appointment. so they have a mind and its mental factors, accompanying mental factors, have the same object. They have the same time. They have the same duration. Things like this. There are 5 different things. We'll talk in detail. We talk more in low rig. May come in one of the other sections. They're called the 5 similarities between a mind and its mental factors. You can't be perceiving, say with the eye consciousness, you can't be perceiving one thing with the eye, seeing a red rose and having a feeling that is derived from some different object. They have some similarity or concomitance like that. Okay, so I'll take a look later about try to see in Sankhya Kandra's translation, in this translation, where she added those words. Here it's not clear to me. So the mental consciousness concomitant with doubt and its accompanying feeling that share 5 similarities with the doubt. In other words, doubt is a mental factor. So the main consciousness, the primary consciousness, has to have certain similarities, the same basis, the same time, the same duration as that. And the other mental factors that are concomitant with that doubt, that are arising at the same time, they have to have these 5 things. They are not this doubt because they don't arise by their own force. They are called doubt because they share the same perceptual field as that doubt. They don't arise by their own force. That's the main thing. I'll continue that next time. I know I've already 3 minutes over, but I want to just continue just a little bit more. Is that okay? Tenzin?
Yes.
Maybe in the discussion afterwards, I'll stay a couple minutes more and then Bob can go over it more. So example of doubt tending away from the factual is a doubt that thinks sound is probably permanent. Actually, it's impermanent, right? So it thinks, isn't it permanent? That's what the Tibetan says. Isn't sound permanent? I thought it was permanent. Not sure, but tending in the wrong direction. Even doubters think sound could be either impermanent or impermanent. I don't know. So that is what we call non-valid cognizer, non-realizing cognizer. The definition of a correct assumption in Tibetan, it's yichu. The definition of correct assumption is a factually concordant determinative knower that has not realized its determined object, or here is controvertible in determining its object. In other words, reincarnation exists. I believe that. You could call this correct belief, right? This is what we were talking about before. Reincarnation, yeah. A correct assumption or correct belief is conceptual, so it's a determinative knower. That's what determinative knower means. That is controvertible means it has not realized its conceiving of the object. It hasn't realized that object. So there are 5 types, and I'll end just mentioning these, and I'll go about that next time again. Correct assumptions without a reason, correct assumptions with a contradictory reason, correct assumptions with an indefinite or inconclusive reason, correct assumption with an irrelevant or inapplicable reason, and correct assumptions with a correct but undetermined or unascertained reason. Basically, these can all be included in 3. Without a reason, with an unestablished reason and facsimiles of reason. The first here is without a reason. The fifth is an unestablished reason. Sorry, unestablished. And the three in between, 2, 3, and 4, are all what are called facsimiles of reason. So for instance, if someone were to have the thought, sound is impermanent, just, Bob said sound is impermanent, Dalai Lama said sound is impermanent, and they just believe that without any reason whatsoever, that would be without a reason, a correct assumption without a reason. Sound is impermanent because, not even saying because Bob said so. That is an example of, what did I say before? Wisdom arisen from hearing. A correct assumption with an indefinite reason, second one, sound is impermanent because it is empty of being able to perform a function. It is not, in other words, it is not able to perform a function. That's contradictory. Sound is able to perform a function. It is impermanent. But if you say it's unable to perform a function, that means sound is permanent. Sound is impermanent because it's permanent, essentially, is what you're saying. What would you say if in logic, if someone was debating with you and they said, sound is impermanent because it is not able to perform a function. Sound is impermanent because it's not able to perform a function. What would you say? Why? The sign is not established, or there's no pervasion? Rowena?
I would say no pervasion.
So no pervasion would mean that if it's not able to perform a function, it is not necessarily impermanent. Yeah, that's a possible answer. Could you say the sign is not established?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because sound is a subject and not able to perform a function.
You have said nothing. You're not said
Yeah.
why.
So you could say either in the debate, if someone tried to debate with you and said sound is impermanent because it is not able to perform a function, you could say either tak madrup or kaba majung. I don't know. I think generally there's probably a preference. If both are applied, there's one that's chosen, but I can't remember. Okay, but here it's not talking about debate. It's just talking about in your own mind, this kind of assumption. So you might be thinking that. Third one, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign, object of comprehension. Sound is impermanent because it can be because it is an object of comprehension. In other words, it exists. It can be known. Well, that is called here inconclusive or uncertain. What would you say? Let's see, what did I say? Yeah, what would you say in that case? Sound is impermanent because it's an object of comprehension. Would you say why, or the sign is not established, or there's no privation?
I would say the sign is not established. Or just why? I think you want to know more.
Well, the sign is established because sound is an object of comprehension. So you can't say that.
Yeah.
You'd say kaba majung. There's no pervasion because being an object of comprehension, it is not necessarily impermanent.
Okay.
So there's only one answer that you would give there. That's if you were debating, but this is not talking about debate. This is just
I'm
talking
just
about
trying to understand.
this is inconclusive. So 4, correct assumption with a inapplicable or irrelevant reason. An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sound. Object of apprehension of eye consciousness, not just object of apprehension, but object, it's an object of eye consciousness. Is sound an object of eye consciousness? No. So what would you say in that case? Tagmadrup? Is sound, says sound is impermanent because it's an object of eye consciousness.
I'm not remembering the term. but-
So is
Okay.
sound an object of eye consciousness?
No.
No. For an ordinary being. Buddhas perceive everything with every consciousness. So, but generally you would say so you could say the sign is not established, but how about the pervasion?
There's no pervasion.
If it's an object of eye consciousness, is it necessarily impermanent? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there, you couldn't say there's no pervasion. You could only say, and in my notes here, I'd written down the wrong one. You could only say tagmadrup.
Yeah, okay, Tagmadrup.
That's how the sign is not established. And then what's the next one? Oops. I erased the wrong thing here. You can only say tagmadrup. So the fifth one, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sound sign product in the continuum of a person who's not ascertained by a valid cognizer that sound is impermanent. What does that mean? So in other words, sound is impermanent because it's a product. You just say the mere words. Okay, that is what's called an unestablished reason. What are we saying here? Undetermined, unascertained reason. So in other words, you say the words in your own mind, say, oh yeah, sound is impermanent because it's a product, but you haven't realized that sound is a product, and you haven't realized that if something is a product, it's necessarily impermanent.
See, Venerable George.
Yes.
Yeah, when we took the class with Don before, he thought there was a typo, which would make more sense.
And what
He
did
thought he thought that it was an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign product in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by a valid cognizer that sound is a product instead of impermanent. So, and that would make sense because then your reason would not be validly determined, because the product is the reason. So replace the word impermanent, scratch that out in the foot.
Did he check the Tibetan?
No, he didn't. That's just what he said.
Okay, so this is an assumption on your part. Whether
Yes.
it's the correct assumption or not, I'll tell you in a second. So this is what section is this?
Correct assumptions.
Right, no, but of numbering, because the
Oh,
Tibetan.
they don't give the numberings.
Ways of asserting object possessors, 5, right? So this is just before section 6, ways of asserting selflessness. So here, 5, 6. So here we're talking of Mikshegi Zunja Tak. Below. So the 5th. Okay. Tami Tak. undetermined reason. Kami takpar semi mengepe kangsa ki gyugi chetak le from the sign of product, Tami takpar zimpe lo tabo, such as an awareness that apprehends sound is impermanent from the sign product. And what does this say here? No, that's correct. That's what
Well,
the sentence says, by the sign product, in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by valid cognition that sound is impermanent.
here we change that to impermanent to product. That's the question.
I'll tell you what, because I've gone over 15 minutes, giving you back 15 more minutes of class from last time where I shortchanged you. So let's end here, and I'm going to remain on for a couple of minutes, and we'll address this question and anyone else that wants to stay before, just for a couple of minutes, because I know you want to stay for Bob's explanation. So let's first quiet our mind, relax your body. Most of you look relaxed. I'm more tense than you are. Recall that we have created some virtuous karma in this exercise of the class, and make a strong determination, aspiration, that this not ripen simply in some unimportant happiness in the future that might even be the cause of suffering or the cause of other delusions arising, such as if you're born attractive in future lives, it may engender pride, or if you're born wealthy, you may have, be avaricious and so forth. Whatever way it ripens, may it be the cause of my continued spiritual development up to and including enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. This is what's called ordinary dedication. We'll talk about later, when we talk about the Mahayana, we'll talk about dedication within the emptiness of the three spheres. But due to these merits, actually, Gewadi, due to these virtues, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Let's say this in Tibetan. You've probably heard this many times. Changchub Semcho Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyurche Ke Ba Nyampa Me Ba Yang Kone Gong Du Pel Ba Sho. May the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise. You go back one. That has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which is not arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And a long light prayer for the Dalai Lama. The wish-granting jewel, or you could say wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in the world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, it's the name of the 14th Dalai Lama, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. I don't think, actually the Tibetan doesn't say I beseech, because you can't beseech the omniscient mind that his wishes be fulfilled. Then may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. It's sort of wishing from our side. Then Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine. Manjunath means the leader, Manjushri, sort of like the protector Manjushri. This is referring to Lama Tsongkhapa, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels. Savior of myself and all others, your disciples, please, please live long. This is I beseech you to live long. And then Lama Oso, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far off places, especially the West, wanderers meaning migrator, the sentient beings, mindful of your loving concern for us, as intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, so I will, if you need to get off, if you weren't going to attend Bob's thing, you can get off. Now, just let me take a look at this one that Bob said that Gendon had said. So this is the example, right, of an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign product in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by valid cognition that sound is impermanent. For example,
Yeah, and that where you say that sound is impermanent, replace that by a product. Instead of saying that sound is impermanent, Don thought that was a typo. It should say by a valid cognizer that sound is a product instead.
okay, let's just see. So this is talking about the Tibetan says Mikshegi Zoja Dami Takpar Seme Mengeba, a person in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by valid cognition that sound is impermanent. Ki chetakle dami takpa zimbe lo tabo, such as an apprehending sound is impermanent from the sign product. And what did you say? Is that what he said?
What I had was that in the continuum of a person, the last line at the bottom of the page, where it says, who is not ascertained by a valid cognizer that sound, and then scratch out impermanent and replaced by product, is, for example. So the fourth, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the fifth word from the end of the last line, instead of being impermanent, should be product.
We must have a different, you're using Sanghi Kandos or the other one?
No, I'm using the one we're using, Glenn Svensson.
Right. So here this says 5, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign product in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by a valid cognizer that sound is impermanent.
Yeah, switch that impermanent to product. That's what Don thought was a typo. Because the word you want there is the sign.
An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sound product. An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign product in the continuum of a person who is not ascertained by valid cognition. That sound is impermanent. No, the text says that sound is impermanent. Tami takwa seme mangebe, which is not ascertained by valid cognition that sound is impermanent. So that is this is correct, and I will leave it here for you to continue, and I'll explain next time why that's correct. Okay.
Okay. I mean, it could be a typo in the Tibetan too.
It could be. It could be, but this is talking about. So in the because you want an undetermined reason. So you want the reason to be not ascertained by a valid cognizer, according to the fifth one. The fifth one is supposed to be for an undetermined reason. So that means a reason that has not been determined by valid cognition. Right. Permanent sound is probably not ascertained by valid cognizance that sound is impermanent. For example, an illustration of a correct assumption with correct but unascertained reason, because although being a product is a correct reason to establish that sound is impermanent, that correct reason has not been ascertained, has not been determined. So that just means that this is, the person hasn't realized that sound is a product.
And that would make sense if you scratched out the word that I indicated by impermanent and replaced by product. That would say exactly the same thing as what you just said.
Okay, I will, if it is wait a second. So if it is a misprint, it will be in the Tibetan, but I will check it. I have a feeling that might still be understandable, but I don't want to take any more time
Okay.
because people have spent a lot of time already. Thank you all much. Hopefully see you next week. I'm not sure if there are any holidays between now and then, but take care.
Thank you.